All right, hello everyone. This is my presentation on Anne Sexton. Okay, just some background information on Anne. She was born in Newton, Massachusetts. She was born 1928 and died in 1974. She did live in a dysfunctional household. Her father was an alcoholic, and she was sexually abused as a child, as mentioned in various reports from her childhood. She didn't really like school either. That wasn't really a big thing on her list, and so that's when she was sent to boarding school in 1945 by her mother and her father. And she also suffered from depression. Her nana died, and shortly after that, that's when she had her second child. And in connection with her dysfunctional household as a child, she later in life began abusing her own children when her husband was away or out of town. And then later on in life, she lost both of her parents. So she had a pretty rough upbringing, and I believe that had a lot to do with her poetry. Had a lot to do with motivation and inspiration for her poetry, and just the rawness and the realness that's included in it. So, go to the next slide. Okay, Anne was, in most terms, she was known as a confessional poet. So, confessional poets are poets who use I statements a lot, and they express strong emotions. And I believe it's so important when poets they express strong emotions. It kind of helps them understand their own feelings better. So that's how I interpret that when it comes to confessional poets. It emerged around the late 1950s and early 60s, and other poets that are also associated with confessional poems are Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, and W.D. Snodgrass. And another point that I wanted to make with confessional poets also are the journey that they experience towards either self improvement and change, also. And here's a visual here. These are just some random lines from some poems of Anne's. So we see here it is a lot of strong I statements like "I am alone here" or "I am a watercolor," and "in my own mind." So it's very personal. Yeah. All right. And the poem that I chose from Anne Sexton was "A Curse Against Elegies." So, a direct definition of elegies is a song or poem expressing sorrow or lamentation, especially for someone who is dead. And that's sourced from the Webster's Dictionary. Um, yeah, so I didn't really understand what elegies meant, so I didn't want to touch into that before I began with the interpretation of the poem. So, elegies typically include death and the idea of death, different types of death, and also just to really express the true meaning of death, whether that be an internal feeling or uh, a literal definition of death. So, um, here's my interpretation of the poem in short. Reminding people about lost in the world. Mrs. Sexton disliked elegies. It had a lot of controversy included in it. And I believe at some parts she was obsessive. And I think that she yearned for humans to kind of understand her standpoint and where she was coming from as a poet. And Sexton, I believe that her work was relatable and meaningful to readers because since it was so personal, I think that her words held deep, really deep rooted meanings, and it drew a wide variety of attention um, to the readers. And, I believe she's an excellent poet, and she just went through a lot in her lifetime. Her poems are just really raw and out there. Yeah. Okay, so for the first part, first stanza, we have, "Oh love, why do we argue like this? I am tired of all of your poised talk. Also, I am tired of all the dead." Okay, and they refuse to listen, so leave them alone. Take your foot out of the graveyard. They are busy being dead. Okay, so what Anne is saying here is like society is constantly reminding us about death, and every day someone passes away, and we are just reminded that that is something that we are all going to experience one day. You know, society really pushes spreading the news of death. So, yeah, she's saying she's tired of hearing the same things about death. It's really depressing, and that's just saying she elegies to her. It's just something that she just doesn't um, particularly like. Um, yeah, and everyone was always to blame. The last empty fifth of booze, the rusty nails and chicken feathers that stuck in the mud on the back doorstep, the worms that lived under the cat's ear, and the thin-lipped preacher who refused to call except once on a flea-ridden day when he came scuffing in through the yard looking for a scapegoat. Okay, so the reason I highlighted the last empty fifth of booze is because looking at her life, seeing as how she's such a personal poet in that she has some of her real life experiences poured into her work. I remember her father was abusive, alcoholic in her upbringing. So I believe that her tying in booze and how somehow everyone's always to blame, it kind of had a connection to her life on this part. Um, and the thin-lipped preacher who refused to call except once on a flea-ridden day when he came scuffing in through the yard looking for a scapegoat. Now, this is the controversy that I had mentioned earlier in my interpretations. So she seemed it was very controversial to me because she kind of poured out a negative connotation to the preacher, um, and she's kind of blaming him for pressuring her into this world of religion. And one of the things in her life that mess with her mentality. Yeah. Okay. Says, I hid in the kitchen under the rag bag, refused to remember the dead. And the dead are bored with the whole thing. Now, this seems odd because we know that Anne doesn't like the constant berating and conversation of death, but it seems that she heavily talks about it and discusses it so much, and it's kind of a way as to say, can she does Anne Sexton have a problem with controlling her thoughts? um yeah, does she have a problem with controlling her thoughts and trying to remove interest with her obsession is when she says, and the dead are bored with the whole thing. And the dead are bored with the whole thing. It's like her trying to remove all of this interest that she has with death and trying to distance herself from it. But it seems like she can't do that because her mind is constantly thinking about it. And that's when it goes back to my interpretations when I say she seems obsessive. It's like she can't help but to think about it and write about it and all of that. And it seems like she dislikes her thoughts a lot. It seems like she just wants people to understand her because also in her reports it says that she had mental disabilities, mental things going on through things that happened to her throughout her life, mess with her mentality and the way that she thinks. So this had a lot to do with it also. Lie down where you think their faces are. Talk back to your old bad dreams. And this poem was really interesting to me because it wasn't simple to understand, but once I could make the connection between her childhood, her upbringing, and her life in general after her childhood, it all seemed to have a connection with various poems of hers, such as A Curse Against Elegies. So this is my presentation, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And here's my works cited page. Thank you. Go back to the confessional side of it. Yeah, like it's just really personal, and it seems like it just brought out a lot of strong emotion that people could very much relate to. And at some point, she proclaimed that she was the only confessional poet. This was right before she committed suicide, before she turned 45, actually. So she had a short life, and seeing that her mental issues that she had going on in her head, she brought out into the world with her art and her work. And yeah, it seemed like she had a lot going on in that perspective. So thank you guys for listening. This is the end.